the Army Secretary calls on Congress to pass funding to help Israel, and the Navy's newest ship honors America's youngest World War II Medal of Honor recipient. All of that and more today, October 10th, 2023. Good morning, Early Birds. I'm Jonathan Lehrfeld, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. Today marks 1 year since we officially launched the Early Bird Brief podcast. Happy birthday to the pod, and a sincere thank you to everyone who has helped us with the show, and all of you who listen daily. First up, Army Secretary Christine Wormuth says Congress must pass more funding for the U.S. to help Ukraine and Israel. Wormuth's comments at the Association of the U.S. Army Conference came as the State Department raised the number of American citizens confirmed dead in the Hamas attack in Israel to 9. And there is still an undetermined number of American citizens that are still missing and unaccounted for. At this time, it's not clear whether those missing had been taken hostage, were killed, or are in hiding. Army officials said they are concerned about the ability to meet additional demand for ground munitions. That's why Wormuth said Congress needs to act quickly. There is strong bipartisan support in Congress for aid to Israel, but it's unclear when Congress could make a move. The House is without a leader after ousting Representative Kevin McCarthy from the Speaker position last week, and the Senate is out of town until next week. Israel's military ordered a complete siege of the Gaza Strip yesterday, 1 day after the government formally declared war. At least 1,100 people are dead, and thousands have been wounded on both sides since the Hamas attack over the weekend. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said he ordered the Ford Carrier Strike Group to sail to the eastern Mediterranean to be ready to assist Israel. The USS Gerald R. Ford is the Navy's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier. Its strike group includes the cruiser Normandy, destroyers Thomas Hudner, Ramage, Carney, and Roosevelt. Also, the U.S. is augmenting Air Force F-35, F-15, F-16, and A-10 fighter aircraft squadrons in the region. In remarks from the White House, President Joe Biden warned Israel's enemies not to try to take advantage of the country's turmoil at this time.
This is not a moment for any party hostile to Israel to exploit these attacks to seek advantage. The world is watching. I've also been in contact with the King of Jordan, spoken with members of Congress, directed my national security team to engage with their Israeli counterparts, military to military, intelligence to intelligence, diplomat to diplomat, to make sure Israel has what it needs.
In an interview with NBC's Meet the Press, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the devastation of the attacks has rattled the world and will have long-term ramifications.
We will have plenty of time the Israelis will have plenty of time to look into that. All of us will have time to look into that. The focus now has to be on making sure that Israel has what it needs to deal with this attack and to make sure that its citizens are safe and secure. That's the entire focus.
In northern Israel, a brief exchange of strikes with Lebanon's Hezbollah militant group fanned fears that the fighting could expand into a wider regional war. Israel and Hamas have had repeated conflicts in past years. Hamas is a Palestinian militant group. A Hamas spokesman told the Associated Press that the group's fighters continued to battle outside Gaza and had captured more Israelis as recently as yesterday morning. He said the group aims to free all Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Hamas says it is ready for a long battle to end an Israeli occupation it says is no longer tolerable. Residents in Gaza fear further escalation. About 2.3 million people live in the area, which has been controlled by Hamas for the last 16 years. Israeli strikes in the past few days there have flattened residential buildings. The White House has also asked Senate leaders to fast-track confirmation of President Joe Biden's nominee to be the next ambassador to Israel. Another important story, the Army is making changes to how it attracts and recruits new soldiers. For more on this, Army Times senior reporter Davis Winke joins the episode today. Hey Davis, for readers who didn't see the announcement last week, what's the deal with the Army's recruiting reforms?
Yeah, one of the hottest topics in the Army right now is recruiting, because it has missed its recruiting goals badly 2 years in a row, resulting in a deficit of more than 30,000 soldiers from where the service had hoped to be this year and previous year's budget plans. And that shortage of troops could have a very real impact on the service's ability to maintain units, to meet its mission requirements, and also maintain a good work-life balance and quality of life for those who have joined and are in uniform. And so last week, Army Secretary Christine Wormuth and the Chief of Staff, General Randy George, announced a series of major reforms to the way the Army recruits. She also discussed those in depth yesterday during her opening ceremony at AUSA, and it was a hot topic throughout the day, as you could expect. Essentially, the Army is changing who it's targeting for recruiting, how recruiting exists on its organizational chart, how its leadership is stationed, and then also how they train and use the workforce, and then what measures do they have in place to actually develop new methods and tactics that keep up with the times. These moves, which I'll get into in a second, emerged out of a more than a year-long study process, generally speaking, but a more specific study led by the Army G1, Lieutenant General Douglas Stitt, over the summer. And this study group found some pretty alarming things about Army recruiting that were known, but the extent of which wasn't known. The Army's recruiting crisis began decades ago when the labor market started shifting away from high school grads more towards folks going to college. The Army hasn't even met its contract goals for recruiting command since fiscal 2014. The study group really found that there were some things that the Army had just been left behind by, and the way that recruiting command was structured, run, and incentivized really kept it from keeping up with the times, so to speak. The first big moves, and the ones that can happen almost immediately, are the ones on the org chart. Recruiting command will no longer report to training and doctrine command. Instead, it's going to report directly to the Secretary of the Army. And as part of that, it's going to be elevated to a 3-star command with a 4-year tour for its commanding general. It will now also have cadet command and the Army Marketing Office reporting directly to it, as opposed to living in another part of the service's organizational hierarchy. The hope there is that by flattening the organizational structure, by increasing the tenure of commanders, there's going to be more stability and more ability to respond and implement initiatives when things change in the recruiting scape. Another one of the changes that's going to take certainly longer to develop is they are establishing an experimentation directorate within recruiting command and appointing a deputy commanding general for experiments. That might sound pretty useless at first, but when you think about it, it might make sense. They are planning to take units and make it so that they no longer have to meet a quota to get their checkboxes on their evaluations. Instead, they're going to be evaluated on what innovative tactics they developed and tried and tested through data evidence available testing to ensure they actually work. Because one of the blind spots the study highlighted was that recruiting command has no idea which of the initiatives it does actually works. That's because they haven't had a capacity to study whether all the buttons they push are what's making the differences that they see in recruiting numbers. Another big change is they're going to eventually eliminate involuntary recruiting tours. As it stands now, nearly all of the Army's recruiting force is folks who were selected by the Army to recruit, as a mid-career broadening assignment. A lot of these people who are volunteers only volunteered so they could choose whether they would become a recruiter or a drill sergeant during those mid-career broadening assignments. They're going to move away from that model and establish a new human resources career field just for recruiting. This is going to align the Army more with civilian best practices where recruiting belongs to human resources. And it's going to let the Army tap into existing networks its human resources schoolhouses have in the civilian world for certifications, training with industry fellowships, and other advanced expertise opportunities. This is going to take years, however, as they phase out the existing recruiting MOSs and stand up the new 42 Tango recruiter MOS. They're also adding a recruiting warrant officer career field, and they're considering whether they need to specialize within the officer workforce as well. But again, it's going to take time for those to play out. And then the last one is the most interesting, in my opinion. The Army is going to formally go after more people with college education than it has previously. Right now, more than half of the Army's recruits each year are people who only have a high school education. That was a model that worked really well in the 1970s when the all-volunteer force began. But now, more kids than ever are going to college out of high school, and those who, say, take some college classes, decide they don't like it, and move on, aren't really getting exposed to recruiters that much because of the big focus on high school seniors. Wormuth wants to see the Army increase the proportion of its new recruits who've had at least some college from 20%, where it stands now, to 33% over the next few years. That is, I think, one of the most interesting admissions that this reform makes, that the Army has been targeting the wrong people because it didn't have the ability to adapt to changes in the labor market that have become commonplace in the civilian world.
When and why did the Army realize that it had to do something drastic about how it recruits?
The Army was in denial for a long time about the severity of the problem because it managed to paper over the shortfall in new contracts with a surge of people who would be willing to go directly to training at the end of each fiscal year. In a perfectly functional world, the Army actually has a really deep pool of people in the delayed entry pool, which is people who have signed contracts but are waiting to go to basic until there's space available to them. That's say like high school seniors who have signed but are waiting to ship to training until after graduation. But because they've been underperforming on contracts, they haven't been able to build that pool up. And so they may not have really realized the severity of the problem. But after Wormuth established the Army Recruiting and Retention Task Force under Major General Deb Kutulich, and Kutulich came back and said, hey, these recruiters are saying that we've tried pretty much everything before. That's when Wormuth, after seeing this fiscal year's early numbers going down as well, decided that something more fundamental had to be done.
What stands out to you the most about these reforms and how they were decided?
A couple things stand out to me. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is the realignment of the recruiting force into an all-volunteer model in the human resources career field. I think that aligning those human resources, schoolhouses, and civilian sector tie-ins with recruiting is going to pay benefits in the long term, but it's really going to depend on how long and how well they approach this problem with. They've got to be deliberate and make sure they do it right. But the other thing that stood out to me most was that the study group that came up with these recommendations that Wormuth and George and other Army leaders ultimately accepted did not include recruiting command, nor did it include its parent command, training and doctrine command. I really think that's important because, as Wormuth put it, you can't have the person responsible for the present in the room clear-eyed when they're figuring out how to fix the future. And that really stood out to me, where is the culture of Army recruiting such that you had to keep out the current recruiting force from this study group process in order for new ideas to get in? I find that remarkable. And the fact that the experimentation directorate was one of the recommendations of this speaks to me about what that culture has been. It's been one of, hey, we're running our heads into these brick walls, but if we do it harder and more and for more hours per day and make our recruiters ram their heads into it on Saturdays as well, surely we'll be able to get the recruits we need. This really feels like the paradigm shifting on the way that the Army thinks of recruiting. And I'm really fascinated to see how it plays out. And Army Times readers can be assured that we'll be writing about it every step of the way.
Thanks, Davis. For more conversations like this one, please like and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Also on the radar for today, the Navy recently commissioned its newest guided missile destroyer in Tampa, Florida. The ship is named for Marine Corps Private First Class Jack Lucas. He's the youngest Marine and service member from World War II to earn the Medal of Honor. It was for his actions at the Battle of Iwo Jima days after he turned 17. The ship is also the first Flight 3 configuration of the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. That means it's outfitted with an air and missile defense radar that the Navy says increases a destroyer's tracking and detection capabilities. According to the National World War II Museum, Lucas forged his mother's signature so he could join the Marines before he was 18. When the Marine Corps realized he was underage, they assigned him to drive a truck in Hawaii, but Lucas proceeded to hide aboard a transport ship carrying Marines to Iwo Jima. Lucas's Medal of Honor citation says a Japanese patrol ambushed him and 3 others in 1945, attacking them with rifle fire and grenades. Lucas stepped into action immediately when 2 grenades landed in front of him and his team. Then President Harry S. Truman awarded Lucas the Medal of Honor at the White House on October 5, 1945. Lucas returned to serve in the Army in 1961 as a captain. He died in 2008. The destroyer Jack H. Lucas will be homeported in San Diego. And now, here are some other stories that we are hearing chirps about. 3 officials told CNN that the U.S. State Department is preparing to officially designate the military takeover in Niger as a coup d'etat. That decision could have major implications on the ability of the U.S. to work with a critical counterterrorism partner in the region. An independent inquiry will examine claims that the British Special Forces murdered dozens of Afghan men during counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan a decade ago. It will also examine allegations that authorities subsequently covered up the alleged illegal activity or failed to investigate it properly. In case you missed it, a former U.S. Army soldier was charged with attempting to provide classified defense information to the Chinese security services during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Justice Department said he was arrested Friday. And a group of Pakistani Taliban ambushed troops during an operation against insurgents on the border with Afghanistan yesterday. The military and a militant spokesman said it triggered a shootout that killed an army major, a junior officer, and 5 militants. And on this day in history, in 1845, the United States Naval Academy opened in Annapolis, Maryland. That's it for us this morning. To get more of the top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. Please give us a like, rating, and a comment wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media @Defense_News and @Military Times. The Early Bird Brief is hosted by me, Jonathan Lehrfeld, and produced by Zimone Z. Perez. Today's episode features audio from NBC's Meet the Press and stories by the Associated Press, Davis Winke, Jen Judson, and Diana Stancy. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Gruss. Have a great day.